Hello, my name is Robert Sampson, and I'm a professor of sociology at Harvard University. Today is Thursday, November 20th, 2003, and we're here to interview Dr. Alfred Blumstein, one of the most eminent criminologists of our time. Professor Blumstein is a former president of the American Society of Criminology, and he is currently a university professor at Carnegie Mellon University, has been for many years. And I thought it would be interesting to start off today's conversation and ask a little bit about the background that you have. Could you tell us a little bit about your personal background?
I'm probably one of the most anomalous members of the ASC. My undergraduate degree was Bachelor of Engineering Physics from Cornell University. Most of my colleagues were off to do theoretical physics or applied physics labs. I decided that that wasn't what I was interested in, but became very interested in what was then a newly burgeoning field called operations research, which is the use of mathematical models to study a wide variety of operations. It started in the military, and it's been used in business, and so I started work. The first job I got was doing operations research for defending a fleet against air attack at the Cornell Aeronautical Laboratory. Discovered that I really enjoyed operations research, and so decided that I would go back and get a PhD in operations research, which was being offered by the Industrial Engineering Department at Cornell University. And so my training was in operations research. And that was the perspective I really brought to criminology some years later. I finished my PhD in 1960, interviewed a few universities. They wanted people to do mathematics, which is an important aspect of operations research. But I saw it much more as a systems perspective to examine a wide variety of systems. And I have since used it for looking at transportation systems, military systems, as well as criminal justice systems. So that when I finished the degree, decided I didn't want to go to work for a university, and was then fascinated by the Kennedy administration coming to Washington, and decided the place I wanted to be was Washington. And I took a job with the Institute for Defense Analyses, which was worrying about military systems at the time. And during the 60s, the President's Crime Commission was established, and that was triggered largely by the Barry Goldwater attack on Lyndon Johnson during the 1964 campaign, where Barry Goldwater was complaining about crime in the streets. Lyndon Johnson, as he often did, set up a presidential commission to respond to Barry Goldwater's charge. And the commission had a task force on courts, corrections, assessment, and about halfway down they decided they wanted a task force on science and technology. If science and technology was going to get a man to the moon, certainly it could solve the urban crime problem. So that they searched around, and finally I got recruited to be the leader of that task force. And it was a fascinating experience, looking at the high tech of the military to the phenomenally low-tech quill pen era that characterized the criminal justice system at that time. Computers were just coming in, and so they were interested in science and technology, and I had the task within the course of a year of building up a team, identifying what the issues were, and coming out with a report about a year and a half later.
Al, could you say a little bit about the impact of the President's Commission on Law Enforcement, and in particular your role in it, because it is somewhat unusual, I think, to have operations research come into play with criminology. Do you feel, looking back, that it was an effective integration?
I think it was very important. One of the roles that our task force played was, since none of us were criminologists, that was one of those times in life when you could play emperor's clothes to the people who felt they knew what was going on in crime and behavior. So we were totally naive, innocent folks but also I think we came away with a feeling that the state of knowledge was impressively naive and primitive, and so that there was a lot that we could bring just by asking the challenging questions. The other contribution we made was really bringing the system's perspective to the system, recognizing that what police did impacted the courts, what courts did impacted corrections, and what corrections did or failed to do impacted the police again. So there was a revolving system that was out there that we were in a good position to characterize, to identify, to analyze. And so the well-known flowchart of crimes to police through corrections really was a product that came out of our task force. Also, we were sort of the quant guys in the task force. It was predominantly lawyers, a number of sociologists, a very distinguished sociologist named Lloyd Olin, what was the director of the assessment task force. But our folks had much more quantitative background, much more statistical background, and so the interaction between our relative sophistication methodologically and the substantive sophistication of the other members of the commission worked very well, and I think we contributed a lot to their report, and they made our report a lot better. One of the intriguing parts of that experience was riding around with police cars. Since I knew nothing about what was going on, I would ride around with police, and my regular question was, what do you guys need from science and technology? And basically, it was more guns and more of whatever they had, rather than any perspective of innovation, difference. And so that gave rise to a major effort, particularly looking at the newly arriving technology of computing as a major asset in the operation of the whole criminal justice system, as well as modeling the flows through the system, doing a simulation modeling of courts. And so it brought very different perspectives that I think had an important perspective on an important effect on the commission, but I think introduced a whole variety of approaches that have been important to criminology since then, which has gotten much more analytic, much more sophisticated, much more quantitatively oriented, and that's been important.
That's a fascinating background, because as one looks back in the 1960s, the time that you're talking about, especially when the crime rate is increasing, the field of criminology was largely dominated by sociology and perspectives that tended to focus in on the social causes of crime. What you're saying is that you brought an influence, really, of operations research and a more systemic way of thinking about the criminal justice system, in particular the flows across the system.
Not only that, but it was very much of the engineering pragmatic perspective of how do you address the problem, whereas sociology was very committed to dealing with root causes, and so we started looking at ways to address it as well as to understand the process.
I imagine the reception, however, was not completely open. Some sociologists might have had a reaction that was negative. Did you detect any of that at the time?
At the time, there wasn't much of a negative reaction, but I think the broader field of criminology, which was very primitive at that time, had a variety of reactions. One that I remember in particular was a plenary session at an ASC meeting where the discussant, the presenter was somebody who declaimed the quantification going on. He was a rather distinguished criminologist, did ethnographic work, and felt that there was a creeping quantification going on in the field, and felt that the field is not the criminology he knew and grew up in. And so I was a discussant at that point and said, many fields go through evolutionary change. There are new ideas that come in that may make some of the old ideas obsolete, and particularly of concern, may make some of the older people obsolete, so that their skills aren't in accord with the new developments. And And that's okay, because that represents development in the field. But the crucial thing was not to contaminate his students with not being willing to follow some of the trends, because the whole world, given larger databases, given computing, given developments in methodology, the whole world is getting quantified in so many ways.
So you were really part of a revolutionary movement of sorts in terms of changing the direction of criminology, in particular,
Affecting the
toward
paradigm and bringing analytics and pragmatics.
Sure.
I think it's fair to say not only was the early sociology driven by a search for root causes, but very strongly driven by a set of ideologies that dictated what their policy preferences might be. And the pragmatics of what works was much more being brought on by some of the technical perspectives where you now have the tools for evaluation and assessing what works.
So you were an outsider in a way, bringing this
Totally
perspective
an
in, and thinking back still in this era. Does that mean, were you thinking about issues of crime in graduate school, or was this really sort of a serendipitous phenomenon whereby you were recruited to deal with some of these questions, but when you were in graduate school, it sounds to me like you were really thinking about the systems per se. Did anyone in graduate school talk with you about criminal justice? I mean, who were you influenced by, or was this really a sense in which your contribution to criminology came out of the President's Commission?
I thought nothing of crime. I thought nothing of the criminal justice system. My dissertation was on air traffic control and finding ways to get an airport, to get airplanes onto a runway faster and off a runway faster. I was worrying about transportation issues, in fact looking at issues of paratransit. But while I was at the Institute for Defense Analyses, crime was certainly not an issue, but I was worrying at that time, in the early 60s, about the defense of villages in Vietnam against guerrilla attacks. But that was a separate issue, and looking at how research might facilitate that. It was totally serendipitous that the President's Crime Commission searched around. In fact, when they first came to me, I was deeply involved in something else, and gave them a number of suggestions of other people who might serve as chair of that task force. And they came back about 3 months later when what I was doing was over with. And so I was ready to try something totally new. I never anticipated that it would represent a significant career change. I had looked at other models, had looked at other fields, and got subsequent to that was involved in some transportation issues, so that I never expected at that point that it would really represent a career change. But in a copy of the Commission's report, Jim Vorenberg, who was the executive director of the Commission, did write a note saying something about, we've started a new career, and I just took it lightly and actually never anticipated that it would continue as deeply and as fully as it did.
Sounds like you got hooked a bit on crime, but you really weren't sure at that point where your career was going. Can you say something about how you went from Washington in that era to Carnegie Mellon University? It's my understanding that you've spent most, if not all, of your career there. Can you say a bit about how you got to Carnegie Mellon and what was the environment like there, and your move from systems research into criminology, which at that point was still somewhat tenuous in terms of your future trajectory? What happened at Carnegie Mellon, and how did you become more involved in the study of criminal justice to the point where today you are sort of one of the most famous criminologists in the world?
Well, when I got out of graduate school, universities wanted people to do mathematics, and and my feeling was I went into operations research as a lever to change the world, not to do mathematics. That was the state of the universities in 1960. By 1969, given the war on poverty and the research that it spawned, given the creation of public policy schools at the Kennedy School, the LBJ School, Carnegie Mellon in 1968 had just started up its own public policy school with an endowment from the Mellon Foundation. And so they were going to look at public policy. And the dean of the school knew of my work. I had done some papers based on the research, came down and interviewed me. And we talked. We met in a bar in Georgetown in Washington, and he remembers it to this day. And decided that he would bring me up, not because they were interested in criminology, but because I brought the diversity of perspectives that operations research can bring. One of the first projects I did was developed a simulation model of the flow through a criminal justice system that would be used as a training exercise. We used it on a computer that had 30,000 bytes of memory that we leased on a timeshare arrangement, and we worked with the state of Connecticut to simulate their operation, and it was a fascinating experience because it brought a new tool to the table. We used it for a training experience because the crime bit, the Omnibus Safe Streets and Crime Control Bill mandated planning agencies in different states, and so we brought in these planners, and they could manipulate. They had data on the base case, and they could manipulate to create a test case, and see what the impact would be in costs, how many more judges they would need, how many more prison cells they would need, and so on. So it was a very useful introduction. That simulation model was fairly simple to start with. Then we started worrying about the feedback of people who get released from the system, what happens when they come back. That forced us to look at the question of how many of all the people going into the system are new people, and how many are recidivists. And we looked at that, and we were shocked to see that given the data at the time, about 7/8 of the people flowing in were recidivists, and 1/8 were new people. That opened the whole issue of demography. What's the demographic shift giving rise to these numbers of new people? How are they coming in? And it gave rise to what's the population giving rise to these new people. And we did something that separated race entry. And that opened a whole issue of a recognition that blacks are much more overrepresented in prison and in the criminal justice system than whites. And so it gave rise to examining the difference in those penetrations. And it turns out that the big difference is accounted for by those who enter in the first place, whereas the flow in the system hardly makes any distinction between the whites and the blacks. The probabilities of recidivism were much closer. The time lags to recidivism were much closer. And the difference were basically the sociological one, which brought us back to sociology, the sociological one of the communities that the blacks come from and their risk of involvement, and the communities that whites come from. And that opened up a whole set of research looking at the racial differences within the criminal justice system, which has been, I think, very important.
Can you say a bit about some of the people that you worked with on these projects and some of the people that you were influenced by? And as I listen to you speak, you're moving from the sort of criminal justice system model and the flows that you were working on in the, let's say, late 60s and early 1970s into the research not only on imprisonment differences, as you've noted, but also your work on criminal careers has been quite influential, and you were the chair of an important National Academy of Sciences panel that looked into issues of crime and criminal careers, which to my mind is very consistent with what you're saying in your intellectual trajectory. And so I'm wondering what you were thinking about at that time, and it sounds like you were moving more and more into the study of criminal justice. And if by the time of your chairmanship of that panel you didn't feel that you were a criminologist,
by that time I think probably a major turning point in my career was first the Crime Commission. After that, I did a variety of things and developed a transportation system for Pittsburgh for transporting elderly and handicapped that was implemented in Pittsburgh, and that has now been replicated elsewhere using a broker to match up people with vehicles, as well as the simulation model. It was in the late 70s that I was recruited by the National Academy of Sciences first to do a panel on deterrence and incapacitation. The idea here is that there was a lot of research now coming down the pike, deterrence research, which was driven by economists using econometric models, particularly work of Isaac Ehrlich that stimulated that panel. And there was also work on incapacitation, looking at how much crime is averted by sending a person to prison for a year or two. And so it was a recognition, I think, by the people who sponsored it that, gee, we needed somebody who had the analytic technical skills, not necessarily to probe into all of that, but who could assemble and deal with it. So again, it was looking to somebody with the analytic perspective that could do the review of the literature on deterrence and the literature on incapacitation. The deterrence work was very important, and Dan Nagin was a key player in that. He was a graduate student in the time. The work on incapacitation was very important, and Jackie Cohen, who was a graduate student at the time, was key in that. And so the three of us were the co-editors of this panel that reviewed the work out there. The part I glommed onto that was particularly fascinating was the issue of incapacitation. And what incapacitation implies is, in order to make estimates of incapacitation effect, that is, how many crimes are averted when someone is in prison for a year or two, we have to know how frequently he commits crimes, how many crimes a year he commits. If we're going to send him to prison for 10 years, as is more the fashion today, we have to know how long that career is going to last. So that opened a whole area of very interesting research into the nature of criminal careers. What's the difference between those who commit crimes and those who don't? When do they initiate? How long do they stay at it? And there was this, in order to distinguish crime rate per offender from aggregate crime rate, which the Uniform Crime Reports report, we decided we have a distinctive symbol, and the symbol was what is used in stochastic processes research all the time, lambda as the rate of effect. Here was the introduction of a Greek letter into a field that had great trouble with it. I remember at one meeting, there were a bunch of people who went around with big buttons that said, with a circle with a slash on it over the lambda, stop the lambda, recognizing the intrusiveness of this new perspective, new quantification into the field. So one of the outcomes of that incapacitation project was the beginning of a continuing research effort that I did predominantly with Jackie Cohen, looking at trying to get measures of lambda, trying to get measures of career length. And then this was followed. Well, one of the exciting parts of the career has been a postdoc program that I had supported by NIMH. And we had some wonderful people as postdocs who were criminologists in a variety of ways. One of the excellent people was Rob Sampson. Rick Rosenfeld was a postdoc, Chris Zimmerman. We just had a wonderful group of people who challenged us in a variety of ways. And we'd have a weekly seminar with the postdocs reporting on their work, and a very open environment, and it was just a very exciting time. So I think I learned at least as much from them as they did from me. And we learned a lot from each other because of the structure of the environment.
Indeed, as a participant in that, I can well remember the vigorous debates that ensued, and that raises really the issue of the nature of interdisciplinary research in criminology, because as I listened to you speak, it's really a story about bringing different perspectives to bear on the crime problem, as opposed to starting out with a sort of a priori discipline, if you will, or singular disciplinary perspective. And it seems that the environment that flourished at Carnegie Mellon, and presumably still does, was heavily interdisciplinary in nature. Am I correct in that assumption? And also, could you comment on how you view criminological training? Is that the best scenario, or are criminologists better advised to go into a particular discipline to study the problem? I think I know your answer, but I think it's interesting to ruminate about this a little bit.
The thrust of the Hine School, which is the public policy school at Carnegie Mellon, the thrust of the Hine School is very much interdisciplinary, with a strong emphasis on analytic skills, so that people can bring those analytic skills to whatever problem emerges and that they get involved in. I think there are issues of taste and there are issues of abilities, but we look for people who have some predisposition to being able to work analytically as students, and it's been an exciting adventure. I would hate to say that all criminologists should be trained in the same way. One of the projects that we have going now is the National Consortium on Violence Research, which is supported by the National Science Foundation. That was, I believe, the largest social science grant that NSF ever put out, and it was a $12 million for 5 years, partly to fund research and partly to do training of fellows. Right now we're training fellows as an important part of the program. We have about 12 fellows. Some are in psychology, some are in sociology, some are in criminal justice. And they come together twice a year at the ASC meeting and at a summer workshop. And the enthusiasm they leave our summer workshop with, for having come out of the shell that they're in as graduate students, of having interacted with other fellows from other disciplines, gives them richness of perspective. It was fascinating to note that the second prize student paper today, awarded last night, was by two of our fellows from different institutions, from different disciplinary perspectives, one in sociology, one in psychology, looking at essentially the criminal careers of communities. So that it's, I think, for somebody to stay forever within the same discipline can be very stultifying. For somebody to be strong in a discipline and then have diverse perspectives to bring to their perspectives really enriches the work they do and opens new horizons.
Doesn't that cut against the grain a bit, though, of the tendencies in sort of criminal justice education and criminology? You take a break? Good. Yeah, I think that's a good idea.
Yeah, very
Good.
So this is a good part. We'll pick up with you.
Very good.
Okay.
On the next question.
Yeah, it's fun.
No, we're almost done. Want to have a seat back here?
You look very,
You
both
can-
of you look very elegant.
You can finish my lunch.
We're
Put it up here.
we're able to fool the cameras, apparently.
Feel free to join in.
No. Oh.
So we could, how about I say, one of the key trends in recent, or key issue in criminal justice today. So,
You got Bill Gann behind you.
I heard that.
okay.
That's why I went to Tahiti a few years ago.
Did you see him?
What? Him? No.
Cameron?
Nor his
Yeah.
subjects.
Nor his subject here. I like it when they kiss. when
They're
they speak.
descendants, but they weren't his subjects.
What I like, Al, is when they kiss whenever they meet each other. That's pretty charming.
Right.
Steve?
Ready to go? Yeah, one of the major issues in criminal justice research over the past 2 decades has been the dramatic increase in the incarceration of the U.S. population. And the U.S. has a rate of incarceration much higher than most of the industrialized world. In fact, I believe that some would claim we're the leader. Your research has looked at incarceration over the years, and I was wondering if you could say something about how you see your research bearing on this fundamentally important policy issue of the day.
It's clearly a crucial issue. I got into incarceration issue by one of the first papers I wrote, which came out in 72 or 73, was a paper entitled A Theory of the Stability of Punishment. In the United States, the incarceration rate was astonishingly flat, 110 per 100,000, with plus or minus 7%. And it was really surprising, and I found that in a number of other countries. And so Jackie Cohn and I wrote a paper that laid out the basis for that. When crime went up, we'd find ways to reduce the threshold of who goes into prison. And when it went down, we got tougher on things we didn't care about. Almost as soon as that paper came out, but I think more appropriately as a result of the soundbite in the politics, starting in the mid-70s, incarceration rates started to go up at a rate escalating at about 8 to 10%, 6 to 8% a year exponentially, so that instead of 110, we're now at a rate of about 490, which is a phenomenal incarceration rate. And that's in state prisons. If you add in the jails, we're at about 700 or 800, and I think that's about the highest in the world, and we've recently surpassed Russia. Part of that, and so incarceration has been a continuing issue of research. Look at the demographic effects. In 1980, I did a paper with Harold Miller and Jackie Cohen where we anticipated crime would be coming down, and indeed it did, because of the demographics of the baby boomers coming out of the high crime ages. And in the early 80s, I was confronted with the really distressing fact that the incarceration rate of blacks was 8 times that of whites, an enormously greater rate, and that was seen in many quarters as proof that all of this was attributable to race discrimination in the criminal justice system. At that time, there wasn't very much willingness to sort out those issues, and I did a paper that I thought was particularly important, which tried to attribute how much of the difference in incarceration was attributable to differences in arrest for the kinds of crimes that got you into prison, and found initially that you could account for 80% of the disproportionality by the differential involvement in arrest. That was important to at least put that discussion in context. It's not to say there's no discrimination, but 8 to 1 is an enormous variation in to be all attributed to discrimination. And so there was, at least it started to probe the issue of pursuing factors contributing to those differences. I also got involved with another National Academy of Sciences committee on sentencing, because the technology of sentencing was just starting to show up, largely because of the work of Don Gottfredson and colleagues in developing the technologies for sentencing guidelines. So incarceration has been a continuing issue, and I have highlighted the importance of appreciating the difference across different crime types of the role of sentencing. One of the solutions to the drug problem in the United States was massive incarceration, to the point where 20% of prison population are now there on drug charges. And some research I've done in recent years has highlighted the fact that one of the unintended consequences of that massive incarceration for drug offending was that the resilient drug market went out and recruited replacements for the guys who were sent to prison. The replacements were young kids. If you're in those crack markets, in the street, you had to carry a gun, and so we saw much more volatility, and the homicide rate from 85 to 93 was all attributed to young people with guns. Older people's homicide rate went down steadily since the rise of incarceration in the late 70s. But Fortunately, we're now in a budget crunch, and so the states are having some second thoughts on whether they ought to back off. And so we've seen California pass a Prop 36, a number of other states passing similar legislation to at least think of alternatives to and treatment as a primary alternative to incarceration for drug offenders.
Another key trend in criminal justice and crime has been the rapid decline in the crime rate in the 1990s, a trend that perhaps some did not expect. You've co-edited a book on this, and I wonder if briefly you could just comment a little bit on whether you think this trend is going to continue and sort of where are crime rates going, and is there an easy answer as to what the cause of the decline in the crime is?
It was an impressive trend that started in about 1993. Started down to the point where the crime rate is the lowest we've seen since the late 60s. And the book, The Crime Drop in America, which I co-edited with Joel Wallman, addressed the issue of guns, the issue of police, the issue of demography, the issue of drug markets, and all the factors that we felt were contributing to this drop. The conclusion basically was that there was a turn down in the demand for crack by new users. That meant the old users could be served individually. They didn't need the kids in the markets, and the police were aggressively going after the guns these kids were carrying because they were largely shooting each other. So we've seen it come down from about 94 and flatten out in about 2000, and it's been flat since 2000, plus or minus 1%. When it's declining, everybody is declining. When it's flat, that doesn't mean everybody is flat. It means some are up, some are down. Pittsburgh, for example, in 2003 is going to have the highest homicide numbers that it's had in years since '93. As you look to the future, that there's some pessimism about where things may go. That the unemployment of young people has been increasing because young people, particularly teenagers coming into the job market, an important opportunity for transition from teenage volatility to more mature stability is having a decent job. We're seeing police diverted because of terrorism. We're seeing the reduction of social services because of the reduction in city and county and state budgets. There's a risk that new drugs are going to start hitting the market, and drugs are often associated with violence because that's their dispute resolution mechanism. So there's some concern that things are going to get worse. We're now, the older people have continued to decline, and what we're seeing now is a leveling out of the net growth in prison populations, which have had an incarceration effect over the past 25 years. So there's some real concern it might turn up, and we have yet to see it turn up yet, although I think a number of cities are starting to see that happen.
Al, over your career, you've clearly covered a lot of territory, going from design of the criminal justice system, incarceration, criminal careers, race and crime, drugs and crime, the decline in crime. Is there such a thing in your mind as a sort of a favorite idea that you've had or area of research? And also, if possible, can you say a little bit about which idea or area of research that you've been involved with? What do you think's had the most influence on the field of all the things that you've done?
I think one of the frustrating aspects has been the difficulty of bringing more rationality to the sentencing process. It's an issue I've worked hard at on a number of years. I've tried to highlight some of the ways in which it could be more rational, like limiting sentences to the expected duration of a criminal career, highlighting the silliness of incarceration for drugs. That's been a frustration, and so one of the highlights of the career has been the frustration over being able to move the heavily ideological political environment with regard to sentencing policy. The ideas that I think have been important are probably most associated with the notion of the criminal career, which I think is an important way of looking at the distinctions between who gets involved and who doesn't, the frequency and the danger they represent as they offend, and particularly as it intersects with sentencing, the duration of a career. Another important area in which I think I've been willing to go where others might have been more reluctant has been trying to sort out the important racial differences, the degree to which those are important in differences in involvement in crime, involvement in the criminal justice system, and particularly involvement in incarceration, which is a source of enormous concern. Even if it were totally fair, it would be enormous concern because it's a reflection of the scope and the expanding scope of the criminal justice system. Probably the epitome of the symbolicness of it is the 100-to-1 crack cocaine, powder cocaine ratio in the federal sentencing statutes and guidelines. And I just recently did a paper for the Federal Sentencing Reporter, the title of which is the abominable 100-to-1 ratio of crack and powder, recognizing that it's very important to not just to be fair, but to look like you're being fair. And because crack is sold predominantly by blacks, it looks like they're particularly targeting at blacks. And the rationale for doing that might have been present in the 70s, but I'm trying to get them to do some rethinking of that in the aughts, so that the symbolism, it turns out that in the federal system, people on crack charges serve about 50% more time than people on cocaine charges. So the reality is not consonant with this ostensible horrible symbol, but so much of the criminal justice system is symbolism, and it is very important that we at least identify where the symbols themselves are being more harmful than helpful.
Finally, I'm curious as to where you see yourself going in the future. You're still an active researcher, and indeed you're a career crime researcher, as it were. And I wonder what sort of questions are left unanswered for you, or maybe you could think about it from the perspective of things that you've left undone in your career, but as you look toward the future, what sort of things still interest you? What questions are you going to be tackling?
There's a lot that interests me. There was a session this morning at the ASC meeting where Rob and John Laub reported on their research on the Gluck kids, men, from age 7 to 70. And I was one of the discussants in a session that looked at the possibility of using criminal career perspectives to get new insights into the nature of their offending. And I would like to see work on that. I think the incarceration issue is very important and want to continue pursuing it. And I think people, the ideology that drove the massive incarceration growth is starting to be leavened by budget constraints, and so I'm starting to look at some of those issues. But I think that there's a need that is still not adequately met to deal with the systems aspect, to recognize the degree to which the courts, for example, sentencing guidelines affect prison populations, and the effectiveness of incarceration and rehabilitation is going to affect who's coming back and what they're going to do when they come back. So I think I intend to continue pursuing those issues for the next 10 years at least.
And the field will look forward to it. Thank you.
Thank you, Rod.